Jim, give me the contract we signed yesterday. Julia burst into her department and rushed to her colleague's desk, running past some girl on the way. "Hi," the girl said, but Julia paid her no attention. "Here you go." Jim handed over what she asked for, and Julia took the contract back to their boss. That's what she loved about Jim. He literally read her mind. Julia returned to the department about 15 minutes later. Sitting there alone was Stacy. "Where is everyone?" she asked. "It's Friday, remember?" "They've already left," Stacy replied. "Oh, right," Julia nodded. She sat down in her chair, turned off her computer, and started getting ready to go home. "By the way, you shouldn't have rushed past Jim's wife. She didn't like that," Stacy remarked. His wife had been there. Julia put everything she was holding onto the table and stared at Stacy. "I really wanted to meet her. They say she's a stunner." Stacy laughed. "Yeah, she is, but you weren't in the mood to appreciate her beauty today, and that upset her. I think she'll ask to not have you and Jim put on the same project again," she noted. Julia shrugged. "Well, whatever," she said. "Why do you think that?" she asked. "Because after you left, she started saying that you and Jim are overly familiar with each other, and that you didn't want to meet her." "Listen, Julia, you haven't been working here that long," Stacy began. "It's been 6 months, actually," Julia interrupted. "Well then, I advise you to minimize your interactions with Jim. Step back from all of this," Stacy continued, "and definitely don't flirt." Julia widened her eyes. "Stop. Who's flirting?" "Me? God, Stacy, I just maintain good relations with Jim, just like I do with everyone else." Julia paused and added, "Besides, I'm married and I love my husband." Stacy smiled. "I believe you," she said, "but Jim's wife probably thinks differently." "All right, thanks for the warning," Julia said. She got up, grabbed her bag, and headed for the exit. At the door, she turned back and said to Stacy, "See you on Monday." Then she drove home, thinking that Jim's wife most likely scared everyone away from him. Julia had eyes and saw that everyone avoided Jim, which is why she started maintaining a friendly relationship with him and would continue to do so, no matter what. Still, Julia couldn't not meet Jim's wife since she worked at the same company, just in a different department. Her department was located in the adjacent building, so they rarely crossed paths. One day, as Julia walked across the company grounds, she saw them. They were walking hand in hand in front of her, and then stopped near the building where Jim's wife was going to go in, and both of them noticed her. Jim was delighted, but his wife clearly wasn't. "Hi!" Jim said loudly and waved at her. Julia waved back and was about to slip past, but Jim stopped her. "Julia, meet Mary, my wife. Mary, this is Julia. I've told you about her." "Nice to meet you." Julia stopped near them and smiled warmly. She noted to herself that Mary was indeed very beautiful and even felt a pang of envy. Surely, Mary had a lot of admirers. Likewise, Mary took Jim by the hand and led him aside, as if it hadn't been Jim who stopped Julia, but that she approached them and said something unpleasant. Julia shrugged and continued on to her building. That day, she was on her way to work as usual. "Julia!" someone suddenly called out to her. She turned around, surprised to see it was Mary. Mary had caught up to her. "Hi, Julia," she said, smiling. "Hi," Julia replied, smiling back, though she sensed danger emanating from Mary. "Dear, you do know that Jim is my husband, right?" Mary asked. "Of course," Julia replied. "Then why are you getting so close to him? So here's the deal. If I see or hear that you've been near him again, you'll regret it," Mary stated, and her eyes glimmered with a sinister fire. "We're actually colleagues and just talk to each other, that's all. Besides, I'm married too, but I don't control my husband like you do, Julia defended herself. Did you hear me? I don't care if you're colleagues or what, just don't go near him. Got it? Mary demanded. Or what? Julia retorted defiantly. She thought Mary was overstepping. Or this. Mary flicked her hand, spilling her coffee, and Julia felt her blouse go wet. Are you crazy? Julia yelled. Mary hissed. Next time, it'll be boiling water or acid, got it? Julia rushed to her building, ran into the restroom, and tried to compose herself. And calm down as well. She was already deep into her work when Jim came by. He approached her quietly and said, I'm sorry. I didn't think my wife would go that far. Julia remained silent and just smiled at Jim. At lunch, she joined him. I thought you wouldn't come over, Jim said. Why not? Julia was surprised. Because she's doing everything to keep me from talking to anyone, Jim said sadly. Recently, she suggested I quit and stay home. Jim shook his head. What would I do at home? House chores? Jim sighed and added, She earns more than me. Sometimes I hate myself. I probably should have left her long ago, but I can't bring myself to do it. Don't worry, Jim. I'll always talk to you, but your wife? She's strange. How can she be jealous of you with someone? We're just regular girls, and she's a beauty. Thanks, Julia, Jim said. Listen, Jim, I think she needs a confidence boost. If I were her, I'd see a psychologist, Julia suggested. Great idea, Jim nodded. I'll definitely suggest that to her. Time passed, and the clash between Julia and Mary intensified. Jim was torn between them, but kept telling Julia how badly his wife treated him and how she held him back. Meanwhile, their colleagues watched the events unfold. Some of them tried to stop Julia, telling her not to meddle in that family, but Julia stubbornly attempted to prove that she was just a friend, and there was nothing wrong if she and Jim continued to communicate. The day started like any other. Julia arrived at work, made some tea, then began sorting through emails and watching her colleagues arrive at the office. Then the boss came in. Jim, there's a conference coming up and I want you to attend. Your suppliers and our clients will be there. Plan to be there for a week. Who are you taking with you? The boss asked. Can I go? Julia immediately inquired. I've never been to a conference. All right. The boss nodded. That's settled then. Julia enthusiastically told Jim that this trip would show everyone, including his wife, that they were just colleagues. Jim was silent and pensive, but Julia didn't notice. Julia arrived at the airport early and eagerly awaited Jim. She was happy to be flying to another city and that her friend would be by her side. So imagine her surprise when instead of Jim, it was Stacy who appeared. I'm flying with you, she said. What about Jim? The woman asked, bewildered. Stacy rolled her eyes. Oh God, did you really think he would fly with you? Get real. I don't know what he's been whispering in your ear, but I bet he complained about his wife saying how terrible she is, always jealous. Yes? Julia asked. Yes, Stacy nodded. Have you checked in yet? Stacy changed the subject. Not yet, Julia replied. Then let's go. The women headed first to the monitor and then to the check-in area, and Stacy returned to Jim and his wife. In short, Jim is no poor thing like he wants to seem, quite the opposite. He's the one doing everything so Mary feels insecure, jealous, and considers herself unattractive. But she's a beautiful woman. Julia looked at Stacy in surprise. Why are you looking at me like that? Stacy asked. Look at your relationship with him. From the outside, they don't seem platonic. Overall, in their couple, it's not her who's the monster, I think. That's why everyone asked you not to interfere in their lives and not to try to save Jim from Mary. They've played out this scenario before. Or rather, not they, but he. All right, let's say, Julia said. Then why didn't he come with me to the conference? Why? Stacy said grimly. In any situation, there's a line. And if you cross it, something you don't want to happen will occur. Jim isn't planning on leaving Mary, Stacy said. Julia wanted to argue with Stacy, but at that moment they approached the check-in desk, ending the conversation about Jim. Julia had been away from home for a whole week and really missed her husband. Yes, they talked on the phone every day, but can a phone replace a real person? No, not when you can be next to someone and not have to say anything and still feel good just because they're there. So after her plane landed, she tried to get home as quickly as possible. She barely waited for the cab she ordered, constantly urging the driver silently to go faster. And when they finally got to her house, she practically jumped out of the car. "Stop here, please. No need to go further," she said. Then she headed to her apartment building. She saw a couple standing near the parking lot, and the closer she got, the clearer she realized it was her husband. But who was he with? Julia quickened her steps, then sped up even more. The girl standing next to her husband shook her golden hair and turned slightly towards Julia, whom she immediately recognized. It was Mary herself. "What is happening here?" Julia demanded sharply. "Oh, and here's my wife," said Arthur. "Julia, meet Mary. She recently moved into our building and started running in the park," Arthur said. "Is this the same Mary who used to get on my nerves at work? And here you are, chatting with her?" Julia yelled at her husband and surged towards Mary. She wanted to rush at Mary and claw her eyes out, but of course her husband didn't let her do that. "Goodbye, Mary. We're leaving." Arthur firmly took her hand and led her towards the entrance. Julia managed to turn back several times and shake her fist at Mary, who just stood there smiling. Naturally, at home, Julia tried to cause a scene with her husband. "Arthur, how could you run with some woman?" she asked, looking into his eyes. And he smiled and shrugged. "Not my fault. She approached me. Listen, Julia, tell me, what's so wrong with me not running alone?" he eventually asked. "You never run with me, and you just left for a week," Arthur added. "There's nothing wrong, Arthur. It's just that I constantly told you about her, and suddenly you befriended her," Julia said. "I didn't know she was that Mary," Arthur said in reconciliation. Then he added, "You know, I think she deliberately introduced herself to me and even calculated the time of your return. She wanted you to see me talking to her," Arthur stated. "Why do you think that?" Julia asked. "Because she wouldn't let me leave and kept asking all sorts of trivial questions, and she often looked back, probably checking if your taxi had arrived," Arthur explained. "Probably you're right," Julia nodded. "So, am I forgiven?" Arthur smiled and winked at Julia. "Let's have dinner." "Let's. What's for dinner tonight?" Julia smiled. That day, Julia had lunch alone in the cafeteria. Unexpectedly, Jim sat down next to her, although not really unexpected. Julia was sure he would come over to her eventually. "Hi, Julia," he said. "Are you avoiding me?" "Hi again," Julia smiled. "No, I'm not avoiding you. It's just that I don't want to hear about your wife and life, and we have nothing else to talk about. As far as I know, you've been given a new assignment, so our areas of responsibility don't overlap anymore. That's how it is," Julia said. "Aren't we friends?" Jim asked. "You know, Jim, at work, we're just colleagues," Julia replied, And one more thing I wanted to say. I value this job and I'm not planning to quit. That evening, Julia drove home thinking that Mary was smart because she managed to show Julia how her relationship with Jim looked from the outside, so now they're even.